I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome the very Reverend Dr. John Hall, Dean of Westminster, to our conference. And I first met John in 1999 when I was a member of staff in the Finance Division at the Archbishop's Council in Church House, Westminster. And across my desk I saw a bid from John for some funding from the Synod towards a review of Church of England schools. And that piqued my curiosity, so I went to see him for a chat, and here we are today. It's John who first suggested I might become a DDE, so you've got him to blame, I'm afraid. It was during John's tenure as Chief Education Officer for the Church of England that the General Synod passed that very important resolution: church schools stand at the centre of the Church's mission to the nation. And that was followed by the Deering Review, which published the report The Way Ahead in 2001. And it was a masterstroke, a work of genius on John's part, to persuade Lord Deering, to chair that particular review, which gave it much more cachet, I think, than it might have had otherwise. But it was a tremendous time for everyone working in education, and is the foundation for all the work we do today, really. John became Dean of Westminster on the 2nd of December 2006, and in this role he carries out a very substantial and important and probably unique ministry at the very heart of our national life. Now, as we all know, there are many splendid and indeed solemn services and occasions in Westminster Abbey, various memorial services, services to commemorate national events and so on, moments of history. But fundamentally, the Abbey is a working church. And I'm sure we'll hear some of John's experiences in a few minutes. I've given John the brief of speaking about church and state in the 21st century, but I hope he's going to say a little bit about education too. And I know it is a subject on which John can speak with supreme authority. And so, without more ado, over to you, Mr. Dean.
Can I do without this, do you think? Can it? If I don't use that, you hear that. Okay? Very good. Is this going to work? Is someone doing my slides? I'm not using them yet, but in a few minutes. So, look, I want to say, first of all, it's a thrill to be here. It's a delight to be here. I've been in Lichfield a number of times in the past, and I've often enjoyed it. I came to Keith Sutton's enthronement here, which would be 1970, I can't remember, 80-something, and because he was Bishop of Kingston when I was a priest in the Diocese of Southwark, and I'd got to know him very well, and I was thrilled to be here at his enthronement. And that's a very long time ago now. And there are many other occasions since when I've been here, but it's a delight to have the opportunity to address you. Church and state in the 21st century is quite a challenging task, and I want to do a bit of history, I want to talk a bit about education, and I'm also going to do a little bit about Westminster Abbey, because Westminster Abbey is a most extraordinary place, as Colin has just said, and it is an amazing privilege being there, and there are so many things that go on, which I think are in some ways exemplary. Some years ago, we had a conference for deans of English cathedrals at Westminster, and I was able to take them to Buckingham Palace, I was able to take them to the Supreme Court, to the Palace of Westminster, and to various other places. Westminster Cathedral, the Cardinal, well, he's not Cardinal now, Vincent Nichols welcomed us. And one of the deans said to me afterwards, it is completely extraordinary to think that we were able to have access to all those places. The President of the Supreme Court talking to us with another of the Justices of the Supreme Court, members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords in the Palace of Westminster, the Lord Chamberlain talking to us about the Queen's attitude to the church and the state in Buckingham Palace. And said afterwards, it just reminds me what reach we can have, what connections we can make. And one of the messages is about the parish church reaching out into its community confidently. And the idea of church schools standing at the center of the church's mission to the nation, when I first coined that in 1998, in a debate for the General Synod after the School Standards and Framework Act, which had been enormously an advantage for us, there were some people who challenged it, who thought this isn't really right. It's surely the parish church which is at the center of the mission to the nation. But of course, in many ways, that's true. But the school, I think Colin talked earlier about the school being on the threshold. It's the threshold of faith. It's a way where the church meets the community in a very fresh and important way. And I'll say later about what I think about the character of a church school. But one of the things that we coined at the time of the Deering Review, and Colin was a brilliant secretary to Lord Deering's review. He drafted the report, which is still well worth reading, The Way Ahead, 2001, and has been foundational for the development of church schools beyond that point and the church's role in education, and is really well worth having a look at. And I'm tremendously pleased about his MB as well, which he deserves, and much more. But distinctive and inclusive was the language that we came up with at that point. A church school should be distinctively Christian. That doesn't mean to say that others aren't as well in many ways, but distinctively Christian and inclusive. And it's really important that it's and alongside distinctive, inclusive, because we're here to serve the whole nation. We're not here just to serve a segment. We are different from other so-called faith schools in our approach to things. So the School Standards and Framework Act did set out various advantages for us. And one of the themes that I want to cover is the idea that much legislation, right from 1870 onwards, has enabled us to preserve our distinctive character in education and to serve within the wider society. And it's really quite remarkable how church schools have survived in our system. Of course, challenged still, and criticized still, but nevertheless still survived. And now, I think, with an opportunity which is greater than it ever has been before. Now, let me just say something about the dual system. I'm going to go back to when I was first ordained. In 1975, I became correspondent to the managers of our local Church of England primary school. And I remember having many conversations with the head teacher, Anne Wedd, who was an absolutely marvelous head teacher. This is in Kennington in South London, so quite a tough area. And the children were, on the whole, quite tough. And I had to learn some things about how to, when I was teaching these children, how to manage children. A girl told me to F off at one point, and I told her that she had to withdraw it. And she wasn't going to withdraw it. And so I took her to the head. And the head said, never, never put a child like that into a corner. They're never, ever going to. You just have to stand back. Anyway, so that was quite an important lesson for me. But we have to learn our lessons. But another lesson was Anne Wedd desperately needed an extra 0.4 teacher. But at that point, she had to appeal to the district education officer within the Inner London Education Service to persuade the district officer that she could genuinely have an extra 0.4, and she failed to persuade the district officer, who obviously had his own, issues with budgets and so on. And I thought at that point, there is something wrong about this system where a head has no power to control the finances and the life of the school. Another extraordinary example, much later when I was Director of Education for the Diocese of Blackburn in the northwest of England between 1992 and 1998, we'd begun to move at that point, but this was a voluntary control school. I went to a voluntary control school on the first day after the summer holiday, and the head was absolutely in despair, because what had happened there was that during the holiday, without any conversation with the head, they had decided to put a new wiring system in the school. They had rewired the school through the summer holiday. The previous summer holiday, they'd repainted the school inside. Now they'd rewired it. So he came into a classroom. I saw a classroom. And the wiring had been below the surface beforehand. But now it was in superficial conduit. And it was all, across blackboards and whiteboards and all sorts of things. I mean, it was absolutely unbelievably bad piece of work. And there was this head, who was, I suppose we're talking about sort of 1994 or something of that sort, who was in despair about the fact that the local authority had taken control, this was a controlled school, and had rewired his school so badly without any reference. Going back even further, a friend of mine was once Director of Education for the Diocese of Durham years and years ago, and he said that the Durham schools had their heads appointed by a committee of the county council. Not anything to do with the schools themselves. They met at county headquarters, County Hall, and they met all day, and they appointed endless heads during the course of a series of meetings all day. I don't think they even met the actual potential heads. And I think they were more interested in their political views than anything else. But anyway, that's another story. So there are many, many tricky stories about church-state relations in education going back. And now we have freedoms and opportunities which may seem a burden in some ways, but are a wonderful liberation, and we need to seize them. And that's the sort of main message. Of course, we need to remember, and the bishop has made this clear, that the church began the system of education. And it wasn't just monastic communities right through, but 1811 is the great moment, as has already been said. Collins was saying this absolutely clearly, when the National Society was founded. And it's very interesting to think of what life was like in 1811. We're way before. This is still George III. I mean, we're way before the Victorian era. We've got that whole sort of regency thing to come still, and kings who had no idea about what their vocation might be. And in the middle of that moment, the church decides, in the wake of French Revolution, that now we have to set up a mass system of education. That's surely connected to 1789, isn't it? 1811? But that's the moment. And within 40 years of 1811, we've got 5,000 church schools across the country. And the purpose of the National Society is to provide schools across the whole country. And that's a really fascinating thing. So the church is the pioneer, way back through monasteries, and then again through Elizabeth's reign. There's a number of, so many schools founded during Queen Elizabeth's first reign. And then later, when it became really systematized in 1811. And when do the free churches get in on the act? Well, the British School Society starts in 1814. So in the wake of the Church of England establishing schools, then 1814, the free churches started establishing schools, and they closed them off in the 1890s. They hand them all back to the state then. But that's a different story. 1847. Now, what's happened in 1847? Irish immigration, because of the potato famine in Ireland, and the Catholic Church, before the establishment of the hierarchy in 1850, decides it has to set up schools for the new immigrants to this country. And so Catholic schools begin in 1847. What's the percentage of Catholic schools? 10%. Across the board, primary and secondary. And it's maintained its position at about 10%. And I remember back in Blackburn days doing research on the percentage of primary schools and the percentage of secondary schools. In Blackburn diocese, 1992 to 1998, part of the diocese, we had 8% of the schools. That was Blackpool and the Fylde Coast. Another part of the diocese, we had 75% of schools. So there was no planning. The Church of England has been very bad at planning the provision of education, unlike the Catholics, 10%, 10%. And we still only have, what is the percentage of secondary schools at the moment? About 5, 6, 7%, something of that sort. Whereas primary schools It's about 20-25%, something of that order, across the country as a whole. Now, what I'm going to do is to say something now for light relief about the Abbey. And I've got some pictures to show you, if someone can tell me how it works. You're going to make it work, Paula? So this is just a sort of intermission, but there are points. I have got a picture of a royal wedding, but we'll get there. We'll get there. We haven't got a Virgin cartwheeling. I'm not showing you that. That was ITV. But don't worry. Well, the point is that there is the Abbey, and there is the Palace of Westminster. Here is the Supreme Court, and we're here first. You have to understand that Westminster Abbey was there first. 960 is the first Abbey. 1065 is the second Abbey, Edward the Confessor's Church. 1269 is this one. And the West Towers, so iconic, so often quoted as a sort of image of Westminster Abbey, not till 1745. So it's been an extraordinarily long development. And if you look at the next one, and from above, you see here is the Abbey, here is the Palace of Westminster. What is the Palace of Westminster originally? You all know this, I'm sure. It was Edward the Confessor's palace. He became king in 1042 after the death of Arthur Canute. So that we'd had the Canute and Arthur Canute, so Danish rule for a period. But his father, Ethelred the Unready, had been king before him. I love that name. I loved saying it again. Ethelred the Unready had been king before him. And then he went into exile in Normandy, his mother being a Norman. And he came out of exile in 1042 after Arthur Canute had died. He'd only been king for 2 years, the son of Canute. And he decided that he would build his palace here, 1045, and rebuild the Anglo-Saxon abbey. And he built it pre-conquest in the Norman style. Absolutely fascinating. Let's go on. So we're inside now. Now, these are some of the sort of connections. Here is the grave of the unknown warrior at the west end of the nave, and we have the candles around it at particular times during the remembrance season. And it's a place of extraordinary power and encounter. So every head of state visiting the Queen comes to the grave of the unknown warrior, lays a wreath, we pray for world peace, and then I give them a tour of the Abbey. We'll come back to that in a moment. And very near there is the Coronation Chair. Now, this is the chair on which monarchs have been crowned ever since Edward II. Now, you don't need reminding when Edward II came to the throne. 1307, just after Edward I. And it was Edward I who had gone to Scotland, having defeated the Welsh. He went to Scotland to have a good go at the Scots. He's buried in the Abbey, and it says Malleus Pictorum, the hammer of the Scots. Anyway, he failed to defeat the Scots, as we know. Obviously, Wales is a principality because he defeated the Welsh, but he didn't defeat the Scots, but he did steal the stone of Scone on which all the Scots kings have been crowned, 1296, and this chair was constructed as a sort of reliquary for the stone. The stone was just under the seat. In fact, the seat is relatively modern. The monarchs sat on the stone for a period. In 1996, John Major took it back to Scotland. So if you want to see the stone of Scone before the next coronation, you have to go to Edinburgh Castle, where it sits on a piece of crushed velvet, purple velvet, alongside that, what they call the honours of Scotland, the crown of Scotland and the sword and the sceptre. And we go on. We're back at the grave, and this is 1920, and we're going forward from there towards the high altar. This is just a 1268, this pavement was laid. This church was consecrated in 1269. This is the most extraordinary pavement surviving from that era. There is the high altar, which is, the reredos is modern, it's 19th century. So we'll go behind there now to the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor. And this is where the Confessor was buried. He died on the 5th of January, 1066, a few days after the church had been consecrated, that he built the second church. And he was buried in front of the high altar, which is just about where he is now. And then in 1161, he was canonized On the 13th of October 1163, they took him out of the grave. There are two interesting people there at the moment. I wonder if you can guess who they were. 1163, a king and an archbishop. Anyone want to have a go? The king would be, okay, guess the archbishop. Becket. Very good. So who was the king? Henry II. Henry II. So 13th of October 1163, Henry II was there, Thomas à Becket was there, and they took the body out of the coffin, and it was uncorrupt, apparently, and they wrapped it in a silk cloth, and they put it in a new coffin, they carried it around the cloisters, and they buried it above ground now, so that he could be venerated. But this is then a century later. This is 13th of October, 1269, and this is where he's buried. As a matter of fact, this top bit is off at the moment, because we're doing a bit of research here, and yesterday evening, I took some guests, and we stood on the top here and peered in, and there is the coffin of the king, just below that higher level. And in fact, in 1685, there had been a bit of a problem. James II was crowned in 1685, as you remember. And the problem was that when you're putting scaffolding poles up and galleries all over, the Queen, we had 8,000 people in the Abbey for the Queen's coronation in 1953. So there were massive galleries all over the place. And when you're doing all that stuff, sometimes things slip. So a scaffolding pole had slipped through and damaged the coffin of the king. So James II wrapped it in a new coffin. I haven't got an image for you, I'm afraid, but it's a 2-inch thick wooden coffin with steel all around it. And but it's there, and it was just extraordinary seeing it. The Lady Chapel is early 16th century, but here is Henry VII is here with Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth and Mary are through here. Mary, Queen of Scots, is through here. Charles II, William and Mary, Queen Anne, Prince George of Denmark. Queen Anne's 17 children, all of whom predeceased her. We'll do one or two more. That's the extraordinary ceiling, the most beautiful ceiling in the world. The perpendicular Gothic, 1516 it was finished. And on we go again into Poets' Corner. And now I'm going to show you some other things, I think. Shakespeare. We have to have a memorial to Shakespeare, sort of near Poets' Corner. He's not, of course, buried there. He's buried at Stratford. Now, I think I go on next to show some images. So, things that happen in the Abbey. So quickly through some of the things that happen. This is Commonwealth Day, second Monday. You know it's the second Monday in March, don't you? I hope you all observe Commonwealth Day. The Queen comes every year on Commonwealth Day. It's 3:15 in the afternoon. And we have a whole range of different things. This is Kofi Annan and the flags of the Commonwealth and various famous people doing things at it. But other things, the judges come every. Now this is all about church-state relations. Every year, on the 1st of October, or the Monday next after the 1st of October, all the judges and a third of the QCs come to the Abbey for a service to mark the beginning of the legal year. So you see here the Lord Chief Justice. This is Igor Judge, and I think this must be Kenneth Clarke actually, when he was Lord Chancellor. He was the last Lord Chancellor actually to wear the wig, and you see they're all milling around in the nave, and they've formed themselves into a wonderful sort of order. And we have a service, and then they go across to Westminster Hall and have breakfast. And at one time, the Catholics used to have their own separate Red Mass at the same time as our service. But Vincent Nichols changed that, so they now have it earlier in the morning, and they come to our service. So it really does include everyone, and all the judges come. And I think that is a really important point about underneath the radar. It's not widely reported. Underneath the radar, there are so many opportunities the church has to reach out to different people doing different things and to bring them in. And they come readily, happily. And they get preached at as well. Another thing. So remembrance is a really important bit of our ministry. This is the field of remembrance. And we have, it's opened, the next one, by the Duke of Edinburgh has been doing it for a long time. Prince Harry will take over. It has a lot of poignancy around it, of course, because of Iraq and so on. and it's extraordinarily a privilege to be part of that process. This is a brief ceremony, but the field of remembrance is there for 10 days around the 11th of November. And on the 11th of November this year, which is a Sunday, we will have a great service at the Abbey, which will be televised, which will bring to an end the whole of the marking of the centenary of the First World War. So it'll be the cenotaph in the morning and a service at the Abbey in the evening. Crack on. So completely different feel to it. This is Desmond Tutu preaching at a memorial service for Nelson Mandela. And the government was very happy to work with us and brought a choir over from Soweto. So just another event, Nelson Mandela memorialized in the Abbey. We're going to put a memorial to him. And then this is the beginning of the centenary of the First World War, the Duchess of Cornwall with us. And on this occasion, we didn't have the red poppies around the grave of the unknown warrior. We wanted fresh flowers. So this is the 4th of August, 2014. We had an extraordinary, working with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, as it was called then, we had an extraordinary vigil on the eve of the Battle of the Somme, culminating at 7:30 in the morning when the battle began. And now, this extraordinary thing, above the west door, we have 20th century martyrs, and this gives us connections in all sorts of ways. One of these is Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King is one of the 20th century martyrs commemorated on the west door. And in 2008 and again this year, we had a memorial service. We will have a memorial service for Martin Luther King because he's commemorated. Oscar Romero was martyred on the 24th of March 1980. Do you remember that? Just on the eve of Archbishop Runcie being enthroned at Canterbury. He was martyred. He was Archbishop of San Salvador. And it was the most extraordinary thing. And when the Pope came in 2010, I was determined to point out Oscar Romero because he'd taken no steps to have him beatified or canonized, and I thought he jolly well ought to get on with it. So I pointed him out, and that's that image. And I'm very glad to say not only that he was beatified a couple of years ago, but he is almost certainly going to be canonized this year, later this year, Oscar Romero. One of 4 in the whole of Christian history, only one of 4 Christian archbishops martyred at the altar. One of whom, of course, is Becket. So Oscar Romero. Well, that's just me chatting to him. But there's another, and the Archbishop with him. And then I think I've got an image of, we've also got the Ecumenical Patriarch who's been a couple of times during my time. So those connections. But I do just want also to say, in the light of what was being said earlier, that there are many occasions in the year when we welcome people of other faiths. And one of the things that we've really worked hard to think about the Abbey as is a place standing for faith at the heart of the nation. That's how we describe ourselves. Faith at the heart of the nation. Now, we are clearly Anglican, although we are a funny sort of royal peculiar, so we're a bit outside the Church of England. We're not governed by the laws of the Church of England. We're not actually canonically obedient. We don't have to be obedient to the canons of the Church of England, which means to say that I can push the boat a little bit further in some ways than the Church of England would like me to do. So, for example, after the Westminster Bridge attack and the murder of Keith Sawyer and of the other people on the bridge, a fortnight afterwards we had a service of hope. And there's a very senior commander in the Metropolitan Police called Mac Chishti, a Muslim, and he wrote and read a prayer from his tradition. And also Sadiq Khan came to the service, and he read a prayer. He actually read a Christian prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, which was very beautiful, I think. And we had a Sikh praying as well. And it seemed to me that on that particular occasion, not to do it every time, but on an occasion like that, it was really important to bring the faiths together and to see that we can, relate really positively and strongly to those of other faiths. And Michael, you know very well from former Commonwealth days being with us. So it's not just ecumenical. It seems to me that we can, as it were, out of loving hospitality, bring together the different faith communities on particular occasions. Of course, there was a lot of royal stuff. This is Princess Elizabeth's wedding. I can't believe how, you know, the sacrarium was full of people on that occasion. This is the Queen arriving for her coronation. This is my predecessor, Alan Don, handing, I suppose it's a scepter, is it, to the Queen. And look at all that glitz. I mean, it is really important to remember at the coronation that apart from the anointing, there's also a vesting in priestly garments, as well as the handing of symbols, all of which, the crown, the orb, the scepter, the rod, all of which have a Christian symbol on the top of them. It's all about service under God. The coronation has that through and through. And we celebrated, so you see the ampulla and the orb there, and of course St. Edward's crown. And you know, see, this is the scepter with the cross. Here is the rod with a dove. And then we celebrated there she is in the coronation chair with St. Edward's crown. And there you see the cross and the dove and another cross. In 2013, the Queen came to mark the 60th anniversary of her coronation, and we had St. Edward's cross, a crown, on the altar, and the ampulla at that time. And I was really keen that we should get across the idea that service is not just about the monarch or just about, you know, people in high positions. This is about everyone. And so we had a flask of oil carried through the Abbey by a group of people who were all wearing in some way we had to have them in uniform to make the point. So we had a teacher in a gown, and we had a judge in a judge's robes, and we had a schoolboy, and we had a guide leader and so on. So, and we also had a lollipop lady in her, you know, high visibility jacket. I thought it was really, I think the Duke of Edinburgh took a double take when he saw the lollipop lady. But it seemed to me that it was really important to say anointing for service is about all of us. It's not just about the Queen, but it flows through. And so that's that service. And I think I've got one or two quick ones. Oh, Barack Obama came, head of state. They all come, as I said. And the press made a big thing about the fact he put 2008, despite the fact it was 2011, because that was the year of his starting. He was very friendly. And then there's this thing, which you do know about, and we'll whip through a couple of those. That's probably the end, almost. There you go. That's it. So, thank you very much. You can go and sit down now. Thank you. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Look, so I've just got, you know, a couple more points that I'd like to make, you know, back about schools, really. Clearly, our role in education is contested territory, and we're aware of that. But what I'm absolutely wanting to say to you is we must be true to ourselves and true to our calling. Years ago, probably 1998, I was addressing a conference of head teachers in Manchester, and I talked quite a lot about vocation. And one of the head teachers came up to me at the interval and said, all this talk about vocation, I don't understand what you're talking about. He said, surely vocation is sort of low-grade stuff, is it nurses and people like that? And I said, hang on a moment, this is about being called. Do you not understand? This is about being called by God, having a sense of your own personal commitment and vocation. So you know, we had to work through some of these things. People perhaps understand better now, I hope. But you see, the point I was making very briefly earlier about those legal moments, 1870, the dual system begins when they decide, this is interesting, really interesting, who is the Prime Minister? Of course, it's Gladstone, 1868. So in 1870, the Forster Education Act, which establishes board schools alongside church schools, doesn't replace the church schools. Nor does that happen in 1902. The great outcry in 1902, when local education authorities are established in place of board schools, local boards, is that Rome on the rates. That's the cry. So in 1906, the Liberals, who have just been elected, passed their own Education Act, which would have destroyed our position completely. But the 1910 Parliament Act had not yet been passed, and the Lords just sliced it away, and it disappeared. So that was a sort of miracle, frankly. The 1944 Act equally didn't drive us into the... If it had happened in 1948, look what happened in the health service. It would have been completely different. But it was 44. It was Butler, before the end of the war. And again, 1988, the Great Education Reform Act, remember. Gerbil, as it began life, then the Education Reform Act. Again, that in 1998 and other legislation has enabled us more and more to become free of control, all of our schools, and an honored, respected part of the system. So on the one hand, the role of legislation has given us greater freedom. On the other hand, the criticism politically, as it were, in some quarters, has made it more contested. But the truth is that our schools remain popular and do a really, really important service. So this is my final message. Let your schools be redolent with the gospel, shot through with the gospel. That's the true message, so that they catch it. We're not forcing it on anyone. We do genuinely want them to catch it. And one of the most exciting parts of my role as Director of Education in Blackburn and later as Chief Education Officer was going into schools where you could sense absolutely clearly that this was a school focused around the reality of the gospel of Christ. And I can't tell you what a joy it is to encounter that. I pray and trust and hope that your schools, the schools you serve, are redolent with the gospel and that your children can catch it. Bless you. Thank you very much.